apparently some authority here. So,
well, we call it people scholar standard time, Muslim standard time, Arab standard time. So when you're invited to weddings, the invitation says 5 o'clock, but you show up at 8, and the wedding begins at 10. So the lecture was at 10:45. So we're starting a little bit late, but that's okay. So what I wanted to discuss with you here is a number of strands. I'm in no way trying to offer you a solution of what will happen or what we need to undertake. But these are some fundamental questions that we need to contend with. And I'm not projecting anything, right? Because I'm used to that in the classroom where people just become fixated on what is on the projection and they'll forget exactly what you're saying. And then they come back to you at the end when the test is that can we get the slides so we could prepare for the test. So they know the Darwinian system of just giving you what you actually have said, and therefore that's how academia develops these days. So once again, to develop some of these trends, specifically as we have been dealing with a number of issues over the past possibly 30 years, but much, much longer. Just to think about the development in Iran, where a new theory of governance that was developed by Khomeini on Wilayat al-Faqih, which is a new modern phenomenon in Shia thought that we need to understand and please comprehend those developments, followed by the successive changes or possibly attempts in the Sunni world. We do have an Afghan Constitution that attempted to incorporate and include Islamic precepts in it. We have the Iraqi Constitution, but both cases, the Afghan Constitution and the Iraqi Constitution, actually were essentially the considerable contribution in there comes from the United States. I think the works of some of the scholars in the U.S., Noah Feldman's work and so on, contributed to the drafting of the Constitution. So essentially you could say that the U.S. had a considerable say in the drafting of the Constitution. And we're seeing some of the development occurring in Egypt, in Tunisia, and even the experiment of political development in Turkey, contending with what type of a political structure that Muslims need to develop. Now, from the onset, we always say what Islam says. And I don't know what Islam says. I know what the text says. And I know what Muslims' interpretation of the text. And those are two distinct, because often you get told that your office says, can you tell me what Islam says? And I say, I looked up and down Telegraph Avenue, I don't know, I didn't see Islam. Maybe he's on vacation today. But I could tell you what the Muslim interpretation of certain aspect of reading the text. And that's, foundationally, is to make that distinction. We do have a set of texts with us. I always say the Quran and the Hadith are the two raw texts that we have in our hands. And then we have a 1400 plus years of relationship between us as Muslims and the text. Right? So that's, for me, is an important aspect of how we approach the text and our relationship with it. And in our relationship, at least from the prophetic tradition, it says that we can get it right and we can get it wrong. Because none of us is protected from error. And as such, all of our legal discourses outside of the prophetic period itself is an attempt to understand. And an attempt to construct something that results in addressing some of the challenges that face us. Another aspect also that when we speak about political structures and development in the contemporary period, we have to contend with two things simultaneously. One, we have to contend with the Islamic history, both its legal and political. because we are custodians to this long historical development and tradition from the prophetic period, the Khulafa al-Rashidun, which is also a constructed concept post the Khulafa al-Rashidun, meaning that when Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali were present, they did not refer to them themselves as we're part of the Khulafa al-Rashidun. It was constructed thereafter. And then we have to contend with the long dynastic rule. So from the end of the Khilafah of Ali all the way up to the 20th century, we've been contending with dynastic rule. Meaning power was vested in a dynasty that, for the most part, kept the populace or the laity outside of the political process. So that we have to contend with, our relationship with it, how we understand it, and what ideas and thoughts can emerge from the various experiences and development that takes place over these 1400 years. They're not all singular, they're actually multiple, diverse, and are filled with contestation as well as positive engagement. So you have to look at it in the full breadth. The second, we have to contend with modernity and coloniality. That these are things that we have to contend with. Nothing that the Muslim experience in the modern period, except that it has and I don't want to use the veil, but it has a layer of coloniality and modernity externally manifested in the process. And without contending with this, we are trying to construct an imagined space without looking exactly at what had occurred and what was set in process. You could date it as Edward Said from the French invasion of Egypt, but you could actually date it to a little bit earlier. As the Ottomans begin to lose wars, they begin to think that their loss of the war is a result of a particular type of arrangements and changes that are occurring in Europe, and they begin to undertake an imitative project. So the impact of coloniality and modernity imposes on us a certain trajectory that I define to be an imitative project. And we're still contending with this imitative project. We see it considerably in relations to our scientific focus on science and technology as a way to uplift ourselves, in essence to say, can we catch up with Europe? And recently I said in an article about Islamic Reformation, we are constantly attempting to answer the West that's in our minds. It's as if we're having a conversation with the West in our mind, and we are dealing in a double consciousness using Du Bois's concept. But I think if we are only limited to double consciousness, I think we're okay. We're having multiple personalities or multiple consciousnesses that are simultaneously acting upon us that prevent us actually from speaking in our own voice. Because we're always answering or attempting to answer that question that is in our mind, and that results in us limiting our scope of the possibilities to that relationship between us and the West. For example, the longest standing relationship that the Muslim world has, and the Arab world has, is actually with China and Asia. But you would not find anyone writing about answering the questions that Asia poses on us. And for example, the Silk trade route is the longest present relationship in trade, in economics, between Asia and the Arab world. And as such, we don't see that as part of the constitutive elements relative to the Muslim world. We see it also in terms of what we often try to present. We always try to say that the Muslims translated Greek works. Well, big deal, yes, we did. But we translated also, and I'm saying we in here, we translated Indian works, that was the foundation of a lot of the mathematics. We translated a lot of Chinese works, but we don't mention those, or also some from North Africa and parts of Africa in general. So our preoccupation with the West as the epistemic locale in our own mind to create that conversation. That project has to be an aspect where we actually are thinking of power and not thinking of our place in the world. And I think in here, defining or separating between that which is spiritual and that which material. In essence, in our engagement, we're engaged in the material. And we're trying to constantly catch up or be in concert with the material rather than the spiritual. Now, some of the key issues that I would like to contend with, and this is where the rereading of the Medina Charter, the Medina, I don't like to use the term constitution because once again, that begins to try to use modernity, development of nation state to try to imply, reading the past into the present, say we have a constitution. In essence, say we have something that is similar to you. Once again, what is the basis of the comparisons and what is the basis? I think the language has to be confined to the language that is used. Some of the issues that we need to deal with in Muslim majority countries. What is the nature of citizenship? Right? That's an important question. And can we think of citizenship in the classical pre-modern, where it was based on confessional basis? And the rights that were accorded to one group or the other was confined to confessional basis, thinking of the arrangement of the people of the book, where the Jews and the Christians and in Zoroastrians likewise were accorded certain consideration by comparing them to the people of the book, and even in the Indian subcontinent certain recognitions were given to Hindus under Muslims. So is that the framing in relation to citizenship? Now you see some of those arguments even in the most recent discussions in Egypt. There were some groups which in my sense were infused into the debate as a way of trying to push certain parameters more into the right, began to speak about the Christians in Egypt, 10 million, that needs to be defined as people of the book, given protection, but they need to pay the jizya. Right? And all of a sudden, this debate and discussion is occurring right, at a period of time where the society is attempting to deal with some complicated issues at the ground. So we will have to discuss and determine what is the nature of citizenship in a Muslim polity. I don't use the Muslim state concept because that itself is problematic, and I agree with Wael Hallat's new book, The Impossible State, in the sense that that concept of Islamic State, if it is being constructed specifically with attempting to lead into the modern nation state as the normative universal, then we have certain problems because the nation state is self-referential point. That the end result is a self-referential point to the nation state. Where for me, Muslim polity, the referential point is to the divine. Yes, all of our understanding and engagement in the temporal is a result of our own engagement as human beings, but still the referential point is not to the nation state itself. And the second is also the nation state trajectory in Europe has a particular type of trajectory that emerged of a particular experience that emerges out of European history. Now, if we think that that is the best model, after exhausting all of our intellectual energy, then we need to think whether that is the best model. But my reading right now is the nation state is actually reaching a very precarious position. If you think in terms of economics, where is the position of the nation state today, where a corporation has far more power than a nation state? The banking industry, the IMF and the World Bank with their austerity measures bypass the nation state. In essence, the nation state in the global economic picture have lost considerable power. And you don't need to go to the Muslim world. Just go to Greece today with the austerity measures that are being there. Portugal, Spain. But that also on top of what took place in Latin America with the austerity measures in Latin America, the Mexican economy at a certain point was completely bankrupt. So what is the meaning of a nation state if the nation state is unable to provide the basic rights, economic rights and economic protection for its citizens? Right? So that's a big question there. More critically, what is the meaning of a nation state today where you have drones that are basically can pick you up in your own bedroom without any reference point to the sovereignty of the nation state? Right? So what is the sovereignty of Pakistan as a nation state? Where a drone are covering the full scope of the nation state with impunity in Yemen, and now we have a whole development of Africa being with the U.S. Command, Africa Command, having invested $5 billion to actually cover considerable part of the African airspace with the drones. So the question, what is the critical power of the nation state at a time where power have already moved from the nation state as a single actor in the international system, and powers are going beyond this. So in essence, if we want to reconstruct a nation state at a time where the nation state have already went ahead and bypassed those structures. Also in general, we also have a coalescing of large units that are attempting to engage in the global structure. The European Union is one. Also in Latin America, there's a Latin American attempt to replicate this. In Asia, likewise. So that's a question. I don't have an answer, but I'm posing the question that the nation state as the normative structure in the modern political system is increasingly precarious, both on the economic, military, but also as a unit that have an impact on the overall system, and non-state major actors are having considerable leeway. The last part is to think also in the emergence of what we call the private contractors that are no longer subject to even international law. Right, so we have private contractors that were extensively used in Iraq, extensively used in Afghanistan. Now they are located in part of the Gulf states, where you have, they change their name, right, every other day. So you have Blackwater, Chauki, they're changing their name. But the question is that they are not subject to nation-state regulations or international law. And they have complete impunity in relations to their conduct. So that's a question for us of what is the issues relative to the modern nation state. Now, also there's the framing or thinking of minorities, right? Where you have the religious identification, then thinking of minorities in the larger aspects of the Muslim world. Now, majority-minority relationship is a relationship that has considerable history of fragmentation, contestation, and also the arena of intervention. How do we approach this multiplicity in relations to the Muslim world? Not only religious, but also ethnic diversity. This is at a time where we are attempting to construct a national project, where a national project has been imitated in the sense of thinking of one identity. I think Turkey right now is attempting to deal with this in relations to the Kurdish population, in North Africa in relations to the Berber. Right? You could see some of those other relationships in Pakistan, in Iran. So how to deal with ethnic minorities where each of the nation-state conceptualization is think of constructing a national project with a singular identity. And forced upon it is also a singular language. that's been the case, and that's where the Iranian model in the early 1930s and the Turkish model wanted to replicate this particular type of nation-state development, right, where a singular national identity as the mode of engagement in the modern world. For me, though, that this singular identity is antithetical to my Islamic reading of the text. Because multiplicity and diversity of languages is the divine sign. Right? The Quran says, وَمِنْ آيَاتِهِ اخْتِلَافِ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ وَأَلْسِنَتِكُم. From the divine signs of God is the diversity of your skin tone and your tongue, meaning your language. And as such, trying to construct a singular national identity, and in here race has to be factored in relation to national identity, right? And we still have to have a whole discourse on race, because it seems that I'm a very critical person who says, well, Islam does not see racism. Once again, who is Islam? And Muslims do see race and act upon race. And I just recently, if you go to, I just was in the Gulf, and I always take pictures of advertisement, because ads tends to reflect what are the values or what are the societies. In all of the Gulf ads that I photographed, I did not see a face that looks like me or darker. All what I saw is all these European faces, white, right, is right, reflected in the imagery, and as such, race, while we say Islam, right, our understanding of Islam does not promote race or racism. Muslims do have or internalize race and racism, and essentially have taken it in relation to the Islamic, and that's where in Arabic we say "Uqdat al-Khawaja," right? So that's why if you want to go to the Arab world and have impact, bring a blonde-haired, blue-eyed person with you and get the contract. That's just what you call the reality of what's on the ground. So we have to contend with the centrality of race in terms of the discourse. And you could see it in intellectual pursuit, and that's where Eurocentric knowledge production, we are all subject to Eurocentric knowledge production. Okay? So you could write the best treatise unless somebody, what you call, from the Northern Hemisphere quotes you, you do not exist in the intellectual landscape. Okay? So that's, for me, is that we have to contend with race as it relates to minority and how to construct these minority relationships. Now, we could point to colonial discourse that wanted to fragment and increase the ethnic tensions, but the ethnic tensions were there. And majority relationship were there. Now, from my reading, the millet system was one way to actually increase the fragmentation, as the Ottomans attempted to deal with the ethnic tensions in constructing the millet system. It was a prototype nationalism that was vested in there, and therefore colonial discourse managed to exaggerate and benefit from a framing that facilitated their penetration into various parts of the Muslim world. So that's, for me, is an important question of how to deal with the presence and the existence of minorities, ethnic minorities, linguistic and racial, into the modern formation of a Muslim polity. We go to the next. Now, in thinking about the sources that we access, now the Medina Charter has been utilized as a foundational document for thinking of how to construct a diverse political body and a political project for Muslims. Now, part of the problem for me is that we have accepted a particular framing of the state, and we go back to the Medina document and reread it into the modern project. Rather than looking at the document itself, which is a little bit difficult, because everything we see, we have colored by the two experiences, the historical experience and coloniality, and as such it's a very difficult project, is to go back to the document and make or read the document while being aware of those two dynamics that are acting upon us. Now for me, the Medina document itself and everything relative to Muslim political structure historically is an ijtihadi matter. Right? That is very important, ijtihadi and contractual. Right? In general, we have two sets of, when we think of Islamic law, ibadat and muamalat, right? Acts of worship versus transaction. But even in areas of transaction, the amount or the number of texts dealing with political structure are very limited. Right? Very limited. And most of the structures that emerge out of ijtihad and also as a result of circumstances that cause a particular structure to emerge. So post-prophetic period, we don't have a normative political structure. Normative political structure, transition of power, even the selection of what type of powers are to be vested in the caliph, all were a result of ijtihadi matters. The post-Ali period with dynastic rule, the dynastic rule, basically all of the aspects that emerged in the dynastic rule was confined to a very small elite that determined the type of structures that needs to be placed. And in here we need to distinguish between the legal development versus socio-economic political development that actually had considerable influence on the type of state structure that emerges. So for me, the text is a descriptive, not a prescriptive text. The text is a descriptive, not a prescriptive text. A prescriptive text is telling us what we should do, rather than only describing what occurred in the past and how we could really, it's still a text for us to contemplate because no society can live without a historical legacy. It's what we do with this legacy that is important and critical at this particular time, and how to access this historical legacy for us to be able to form something that truly speaks to our own values, our own worldview, and our own epistemology. So descriptive text, not a prescriptive text. Now, for me, when we think about the Medina Charter, we have to agree that it was a negotiated charter. A negotiated charter between the Prophet, ﷺ, the 8 Arab tribes in Medina, the Jewish tribes in Medina, and at the core of it was a collective defense charter. Because if you look at the charter and in terms of what the language it uses, it actually goes into detail of what are the responsibilities of each tribe as it relates to prisoners and ransoming prisoners of war and committing themselves to a collective self-defense treaty at a time where they expected the Meccans to be attacking Medina. Now, this was not a revealed text, right? And here also understanding that the role of the prophet has 4 different functions simultaneously. He's a prophet, receiving revelation. He's a judge, issuing legal judgment on existing revelations that came down to determine what needs to be done and what needs to be undertaken. Third, he was the head of a state, right? Meaning he was the executive head of a state, and also he was a commander-in-chief. Each one of those functions is different. So it is his capacity as a head of a state that he negotiated and executed this particular charter that constituted the polity in Medina. So you could say it's the first city-state with its surrounding area, and as such, it was a negotiated relationship. What is significant for me in reading the text, it has described all of the participants as constituting one ummah. Right? Constituting one ummah. So the acceptance of a framing of a collective self-defense for all of the participants constituted one community opposite those for outside of the community, and at the core of it was, you could say, diverse in relations to religious identity. But also, if you think of the tribal structure, the tribes, if you think about their diversity, the diversity of tribal background also was present in there. And the Prophet arrived at Medina, a town where the major tribes were at war with each other for a long period of time. So it actually brought to a cessation of the hostilities that were present in there. What is problematic in relations to the text that we have is often people instrumentalize the text to silence the other, rather than looking at the text of how to include the other. Our discourse has been, and I think this is where the impact of modernity and coloniality, of thinking of law, of thinking of text in the singular, because the state wants to have exclusive dominion over the text, over law and adjudications of matter, both economic, social, and political. We have internalized this. This is my contention of the second part, the impact of coloniality and modernity, is that it actually uses the text to silence, rather than thinking of the text as an opportunity to engage and to think of all the multiplicity of possibilities that are in the text. In a similar way, and this is not to glorify the past, but if you read our legal, and here I'm using the legal as a way to look at it, our legal tradition actually have multiplicity of opinion, so much so that some describe Islamic law as a collection of differences of opinion. At the core. And to even the minute details, often you actually contended with 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or more opinions within each of the schools of thought, not even outside. At the core of it, you have 4 opinions, and then within each of the schools of law, there are multiple opinions, and then there is outside of the schools of law, there are opinions. In the modern period, we have become almost wanting to have exclusive dominion over the law, and engaging with people with the text to silence them, essentially using the text as power. And text is power, don't misunderstand, but the more that you utilize it as the instrument of power, the more that you actually can find the scope of your attempt to try to resolve the issues that are present with you. So in thinking about the text to silence the other, and thinking about the modern nation-state project and the exclusivity over the nation-state project, we also have confined ourselves to thinking of Islam in purely legalistic terms. Purely legalistic terms. Now for me, that is an effect of colonial discourse. While I agree that we have the other part that have basically removed political justice from the core within the Sunni tradition, because I think the Shia tradition is still one of their core constituencies is justice, al-adl. Within the Sunni tradition, that has been almost absent. Right? So it confined it to a legalistic discourse, and therefore, if you look at our engagement, you will find a complete absence of the economics. You will see a complete absence, and this is something to admit, a complete absence of thinking of gender in relation to our discourse, especially in the modern period. Increasingly also to think about environmental, and I know that we are attempting to catch up with this, And look how what you call reactionary we get. Immediately we say the Prophet Muhammad was the first environmentalist. Right? So you have a whole book saying the Prophet Muhammad is the first environmentalist. And this becomes what you call is a discourse of silencing and not actually engaging of your own participation of being an environmental destructive person. And I'm very critical because we're coming on to Ramadan, right? Do you know that there's a study that Muslims in Ramadan consume more food than before Ramadan? So we actually missed the point. Because for me, Ramadan is how to reduce your carbon footprint on others. And therefore, we often say, well, we want to feel the suffering of the poor. That's not what we're being asked to do, is to feel your impact on the poor. That's what the essence of Ramadan is. Not to say, oh, I feel hungry because the poor is feeling hungry. No, it's to think about your overconsumption that results in the poor being the poor, because we don't have a problem of lack of production, it's the lack of distribution we have. That's what the problem is, lack of distribution. In the US, we produce actually 3 pounds of food, right, in excess for the needs of the people. And what we throw in the garbage can feed a continent for 3 years. Like Africa, from what we throw in the garbage alone, can feed Africa for 3 years. So it's not a matter of feeling the hunger. Oh, thank you for feeling my hunger. Where's the beef? So we miss the point. So our consumption becomes that we are actually not thinking clearly of what is it that we're trying to actually articulate in relation to our thinking of the environment. And it becomes these, what you call, banners that stops the engagement. Right? The Prophet Muhammad is the first environmentalist. He is, but what are you going to do with it? Right? Aisha said he was the Quran walking. So are you walking in the same way that he's walking? I'm walking to McDonald's. Or Walmart. Or all the destructive processes are taking place. And you could see that we have become commodified, consumer-oriented society as Muslims, because we think of progress in relation to consumption. So we accepted that as the basic contours of how to be modern and how to be engaged in the world. So there has to be a commitment in how we read these aspects in general. Now, it's not easy or helpful to utilize the Medina Charter and constituting it as the revealed text that we only access and instrumentalize for political purposes. It's not helpful or easy. Because once again, we are leveraging the past in order for us to give ourselves the garb of religious purpose. And I think it's important for us to understand that I am speaking as a human being that is reading a religious text. Me reading a religious text does not make me divine. I am understanding in my human capacity a revealed text and limited by my capacity as a human being. And as such, I don't want to use the text to convey on myself a divine spiritual purpose. And for me, that is at the core of it, of putting the self as the referential point for really worshiping the self rather than God. You know, talking about purifying oneself. The more finer point of idolatry is not the statue, it's actually worshiping the self. Worshipping the statue is a very easy, what you call, thing to contend with, because you can say, oh no, no. But it's the self that you pose it up and acting upon it in ways, including ornamenting your opinion by certain religious texts as a way to essentially to say that I am divine by means of accessing the text. So I don't want to use the text in that way, rather than to try to see, can I understand the text to resolve some of the issues that we are contending with. Let me conclude the following, so we could have some time for basic questions. For me, any Muslim polity has to be founded upon justice. There is no polity that could have a purpose if it is not founded upon justice. Why? Because for me that the divine name is Al-Adl, right? The all just, both in himself, meaning God, and in any outcomes that are related to that. So justice is a foundational basis for any Muslim polity. Second, equality. Second is equality. Now, equality in its foundational basis does not mean that has to be an equality in outcome. It's an equality in the basis and in participation and belonging to the polity, which includes equality to every participant in the polity. I reject the notion that, for example, today to say to the Christians in Egypt that all of a sudden you have to accept a second-class citizenship. Why? Because if you use the classical construction on a confessional basis, that was for a particular time, a particular era. And as such, we need to think of if there's an acceptance of all the participants in the polity to have defense of the polity and to serve it, then they have to have equality as a constitutive element of the Muslim polity. That, for me, is a foundational in terms of equality. Third, there cannot be a Muslim polity without thinking of the economic. Okay? I'm very critical of Muslim economics today where they have Bismillah in the top and Alhamdulillah at the end and then Adam Smith in between. And Milton Friedman. Right? Alhamdulillah, Adam Smith said. That's how our Muslim economics, and you could rationalize this in a variety of ways, unless we deal with the economic foundation of the Muslim polity, then we're actually replicating the same inequalities that exist today. And I'm really very happy and delighted to see the Pope Francis' statements on economics is actually more progressive than many of the Muslims who are reading the sacred text, where the only place in the Quran actually God declares war is in usury. The only place God declares war on usury, but essentially we became Bismillah and Alhamdulillah, Adam Smith, and so on. That doesn't mean that we don't have complexity. We do, but there has to be a firm commitment that economics have to be based on equality and at least achieving the equality within our own discourse and with our own actions. You cannot catch up to Goldman Sachs. Right? That's not the standard. We have a standard that has to be at the constitutive elements within our own Muslim economic discourses, and that has to be in a Muslim polity, that has to be addressed and that has to be solved. The fourth element, and this relates to thinking in a Muslim polity, that there has to be an understanding and appreciation of the openness of the borders of people, which is related to the economics, and therefore we have to address the notions of the movement of human beings from one place to another. Muslim polities, at least my reading of the classical period, did not construct borders nor walls. We cannot commit ourselves to a Muslim polity that constructs walls. Walls that prevents people from moving. Now, the international system today allows capital to move, but they don't allow human beings to move. Allows capital, resources to move. So, for example, in the NAFTA that was constructed, right, between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada, and then also the bilateral treaties, they're allowing capital to move, but not people. In the European Union, there is movement within the European Union, but there is no allowing movement or free movement from sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, or Turkey in Europe, so there's considerable confinement. And then I don't want to be hypocrite. There is no movement in Muslim majority countries, especially in the Gulf, where you have a labor force that is constituting the majority, where the minority elite rules the state, and therefore, including Arabs moving into the Gulf, they don't have the rights to actually movement and being able to have residency and citizenship. That has to be a value that has to be vested. And there are many discussions of how to bring about a reduction of the need for people to move. People move because their economies have been destroyed. Right? The people in North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa are moving not because they don't like their countries, because their ravages over the past 300 years have made their economy an economy that is only subservient to the global north. And you should not at any given time say that the global south is poor. It's not. The global south is rich, and in particular Africa is one of the richest continents in the world. On a yearly basis, it sends net outflow of capital to the north to the amount of $142 billion. So while we give, quote unquote, foreign aid, we give 10, we take 14 for each dollar. Right? So that structurally has to be addressed in order to reduce the causes of movement. Right? People don't leave their country because they don't like the country, it's because they're forced as a result of economic, political, social factors that are there, a result of 200 plus years. That results for this movement. So a Muslim polity has to be committed to this aspect in relation to open borders and based on a relationship of taradi, which is an important concept in the Quran in relation to economic discourse, that in contentment with both party to any agreement on taradi, not on compulsion. So you can't bring democracy on the tank, you can't bring equality by the IMF and the World Bank austerity measures, nor you could bring about a facilitation with building walls, both on the Mexican border, but also as a Palestinian with the apartheid wall. So in essence, we have to think in those and push for it as a commitment to a particular type of relationship between people and facilitated those movements as such. So thank you for listening.
Yes.
No.
No, I mean, since yesterday, I was thinking, given the very elegant initial framework and the provocation to think about transformational Islam, and about the imperative to improve the world. Right? My question since then, I have been sort of listening to the different expositions, trying to find elements to understand what is better, or what is the criteria to identify what would be better vis-a-vis what would be worse. And I think that here you have thrown to the table several, but particularly two very strong elements that I think for you they would seem to be key into anything that we would consider a better world. On the one hand, the rethinking of the economic foundations of our societies, so that we are not only mirroring the economic foundations provided by European intellectual theories and so on, and on the other hand, a rethinking of the boundaries, how boundaries works, right, and how it's related to your critique also of the nation state, which is also bounded. So you are sort of calling or inviting us to think about a better world in terms of the radical critique of the creation of these boundaries and of the economic principles that drive most of our societies. Then if so, then I wonder if we're already crossing the line between, and this is partly rhetorical to invite the conversation, partly perhaps not, but I wonder if that crosses the line between a transformational Islam and a revolutionary Islam. And I don't mean revolutionary in the sense of armed revolution at all. I think revolutionary in terms of thinking radically the foundations of something, right? So that it's not only about, it's not about transforming a reality, but in a way about revolutionizing, in a way about thinking a new base. Now, the new base that you propose, rethinking economics and borders, will be a threat to European powers and to European conception of the order of the world, but also to many of the so-called, quote-unquote, Islamic states that have intentionally or unintentionally followed some of those principles. So that's why also I think it would be revolutionary, not only revolutionary with respect to Europe, but revolutionary with respect to the entire world order, right? And not necessarily unrevolutionary at all, again. So I wonder if you can speak about that. And second, related to that, and more shortly, I wonder what is the impact of your discourse I mean, I can see how your invitation and provocation can be felt in different parts of the world out of Europe, right, where you are asked not to depend on these European foundations of the nation state or economics. But I wonder, how does European Islam take that? How an Islam that is already in Europe, living where those foundations were developed and have been implemented? What is the implication of that call for European Islam? How Muslims in Europe take this call seriously, where European countries are already divided in this way, where capitalism is already structured in this way? Is it about joining solidarity movements with other people that are also questioning borders and economics? What exactly is it?
I have to think about the distinction between transformative and revolution. So that's a question that I need to think about, Wilson, and maybe we'll have a conversation about it to see what the distinction, which is an important one. For me, there has to be a challenge to the Northern Hemisphere stranglehold on the political, economic, social, academic structures that we have. And also challenge to the Southern Hemisphere post-colonial states. Because these post-colonial states are replicating the colonial structure just without boots on the ground, even though that today we have drones in the skies rather than boots on the ground. So the same dynamics of power is there. So the challenge has to be to both, and to try to create something that is different and that challenges what I consider to be a major, not only a problem, but a catastrophe that we're looking at in relations to a global picture that is dismal. So for me, that's the project, that's where the transformation that I'm calling for. And for me, economics is very important because while many religious figures tend to focus on the social aspect, I think it's mistakenly so, because it's the economics that makes individuals undermine their social status. It is much more profound if you make people in a state of poverty for them to lose hope and begin to commodify themselves in the market as a result of the poverty that is placed upon them. And then religious discourse comes and blames the individual for the social degradation that takes place as a result of the economic factor. And I think in here it's very important for us to push for the economic factor as a way of trying to make the change that is needed without thinking that is the only factor, because that becomes only materiality. And if you only focus on materiality, then basically you become a worshiper of the material. So I still confine it with a larger aspect, but that's what's the important part. Now, as far as Muslims in Europe and the United States and Canada, I think there's only few that are thinking on those terms and thinking about the alliances that needs to be struck. I often say in the U.S. That Muslims in the U.S. think of Hajj about going around the White House 7 times. Okay? So Hajj is not complete until you go 7 times around the White House. That basically leaves the conceptualization of what it is to constitute powers from the ground up. Muslims have been preoccupied with making it into, quote, the White House, meaning they strike their strategic relations with what they consider to be the power structure. And one of the most, and here because I know the U.S. in very close details, one of the most contested items among Muslim leadership is who gets invited to the White House iftar and who gets invited to the State Department's iftar. And my answer to that is that you're invited to the iftar, but you're on the menu. Which means of how to rethink the relationship, how to strike a strategic relationship of a transformative political structure with African Americans, with Latinos, with Asian Americans, with Native Americans, and with the progressive segments within the wide political landscape, even though that it has its own problematic. But that conceptualization is actually confined to the few. And I think a similar dynamics, I would assert, is present in Europe, where the preoccupation is to actually be part of the country club and not constituting your own, what you call, alliance that has a different political perspective altogether. That's the challenge, and I think that's where the work needs to be done.
Thank you, Hatem. It was brilliant, sincerely. I have a question. You said about the first environmental. I want to ask the question: what does it mean at a time where modernity and solution didn't exist?
No, I said that Muslims, in their response to trying to engage in environmental consciousness, they use this banner that the Prophet was the first environmentalist,
Okay.
which is used as a way almost to not engage.
Okay.
Right? So rather than thinking of the difficult questions and your engagement, the Prophet becomes an instrument to lack of engagement rather than engagement. So that's what I'm saying, not to imply that.
So look, there is a problem here because there are 7 hands and we don't have much time. So I think we can take discussion. This afternoon we have 2 hours, and then there is also this panel in the evening. So if it's not directly focused on what was said now, just wait for this afternoon. If we can just take 3, so out of Europe. So 1, 2, and 3, and the rest is for the discussion. We take the 3, and then we go ahead and then.
Thank you for your speech. Just I want, like, when you mentioned that the Prophet was a political leader, and like also like he was indulged in economy. Now, the problem I find, like for us as a young generation, when we have the religious scholars, either in the West or in the East, most of them, especially in the East, they all the time they say we don't have to interfere in politics. We have the leaders. You have to keep, and especially they emphasize this, especially in Friday's speech, khutbah, and in all the classes, and especially when they speak to the young generation. And also they focus on the point that you have to be very far away from politics because this is problematic for you, and just keep your mind closed regarding this. And also when they speak about economy, they try to focus and to strengthen in the minds and in the hearts of the young generation that you have to be in zone and you don't connect to material things, and you have to leave because we have the afterworld for us, and now we are just in. So it's a process that the young generation, when they are like, they start going to the mosque or to these like circles from the age of 7 until they are 20 or 25. So they, through all this, they construct this, and especially when you want to discuss with them, you can't because khalas, it's accumulated. So this is real challenge how we can deal with this.
Yeah. Now,
Take the 3 of the 3.
yes, then we'll answer. Okay.
You've mentioned the 4 values. It's quite interesting because there's a connection to the former lecture in which it was stated that the Muslim movements focus a lot on the legalistic approach on power, but didn't focus on the constitutional values aspect. And my question is, why do Muslim movements always go in the same trap without learning from their faults or from their failures? And is it due to the fact that maybe they're seeking the power and losing their wisdom on their way, or is there something wrong in their ideological framework? So why don't they, or why isn't it apparent that they catch those 4 values?
And last one, yes.
Thinking about communities within Europe which are subalternized by hegemonic nationalisms, such as Scotland, Catalonia, Basque Country, and even autonomous movements, such as the small one in Andalusia itself. What opportunities do you think these independentist movements present for Muslims in Europe?
Which was the last part?
What opportunities do you think these movements and these tendencies present for Muslims in Europe in terms of transformative, making new political realities or decoloniality or stuff like that?
Okay. So these three questions. First, in terms of religious leadership and their role overall. Now, we have to accept that there is such thing as state-mandated religious leadership. Okay? Sometimes you get asked a question about all the sermons that are being preached in the mosque. Why don't you condemn them? I said, why don't you ask the mukhabarat about them? I'm not the one who sent them these khutbahs. Okay? So, across the Muslim world, for the most part, the sermons are state-mandated. The mukhabarat send you, weekly what you need to go on the minbar and to do a dua for the tyrant. May Allah preserve him and give him wisdom for killing more of us. Ameen. And that's basically what you have in relation to state-mandated preaching that occurs. And that's a problem that we have to contend with overall in order for us to make sure that our religious leadership is not essentially maintaining the status quo and causing us to really not to be critical and engaged. Second, I'm also very critical about the training that our religious leadership does. Now, if you go through Al-Lazhar as a training, you basically read a very confined set of texts. Most often you will finish, in terms of Islamic law, al-ikhtiyar, right? Or if you are Shafi'i, Matan Abi Shuja', Maliki, Risalat Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qairani, which is a very, rudimentary engagement of the basic classical canon. There isn't any engagement beyond this, which essentially begins to be a problem because both the legal, economic, and other aspects of the society have completely transformed themselves in unrecognizable way. And as such, we have to rethink about Islamic education in a very, very critical way, not only for Muslims in general, but specifically our religious leadership that is being trained in a particular type of paradigm that does not take account of the multiplicity of changes that took place. And I think you see some of that taking place, and I think that's where some of the investments have to be occurring. So that's, for me, it's an important, critical part that needs to be engaged. Now, Muslim movements not learning from their failures, for the most part, there isn't what you call a self-study taking place in many of these movements, with possible exceptions. And we assume that the failure is just a result of the oppression that has been conducted or carried out against us. There is no systematic study of the causes of what happened and why these causes occurred, and assessment of the various actors that have resulted. Now, part of it is sometimes that you're in a box and you're preoccupied with engaging in the box and not getting the opportunity to go outside the box to examine. But most Muslim movements have not had this circular feedback process to look at what happened, study the circumstances, and then bring back some changes in approach and in focus overall. Maybe I would say with the exception possibly with the Turkish engagement, that Turkey has been far more sophisticated in terms of the AKP and the political leadership in there. They learned from the coup that was taking place against Erbakan and the Muslim movement in there. They did studies and they came back to engage in a different way. In parts of the Arab world, that has not taken place. In the Indian subcontinent, likewise, that has not taken place. So that's an important factor in terms of how to engage and how to get Muslim movements to do the needed studies and the needed engagement in order for them to correct some of the errors and the mistakes that constantly derail whatever projects that they have in place. Now, thinking about the European Muslims, and also I would say American Muslims, there are many opportunities that are open. Part of the problem in the following is that we approach engagement by thinking in or looking for Muslimness. Right? So I'm also trying to deal with this concept of how we are performing our Muslimness. And how not to think of Islam as a performance, but rather Islam as an active engagement in the world, and not to think of the other and construct the other in the performative aspect of Islam. So for me, there are many opportunities. When I engage, I don't look at, is there a Muslim in there, or should I approach it? I approach it that there is a human problem in there. And, and this is not to speak of my experience. When we worked with the Latino population in the US, we didn't come to it, I am Muslim and I'm trying to work with the Latinos. No, I am a human being and I'm seeing a problem that is jointly impacting us. And as such, that becomes in your framing that you are central to the issues that you're dealing with and you're not preferential to it. And therefore, I'm very critical of Muslims who are totalitarian in their approach, scratch my back, and therefore, I will come and scratch your back. I don't want scratching anybody's back. I want to be there to see people face to face. Right? Why? Because that's a deep commitment that has to be there. Similarly, in relations to other communities or groups, in terms of economic activity, there has to be a vested understanding that we are all together in the same boat. Right? And as such, we have to think in a collective way. The individual might not approach their practices from your religious perspective, but that's not the case. For me, Hizbul Fudul is still an operable way that I will always respond to an individual or a collective that wants to have a consciousness to change to the better the conditions for all. And if I do that, then I would assume that it will improve my conditions and the condition of my community. So I have to approach it that I'm a participant in the table. And not only that, I want to be on the table, to form the table, to think of the menu, to think of the decorations, and to everything in as open as possible while maintaining my self-consciousness that is essentially my own. So, and that's where the challenge is, how to be open while at the same time maintaining who you are. I don't approach it in any type of weakness or fear, rather, I would say that we are able to do that. And there are many opportunities in Europe, many opportunities in the US, many opportunities across many parts of the world. It's just for us to come out of our small silo that we have constructed around ourselves. Thank you.
You didn't answer the final question.
Sorry?
I don't think you answered the final question.
I did.
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah, that was the final one.
Sorry.
So anyway, it's time now. So 12:30, please. We'll come back for the last session.